She didn't know he was still in the building. That's the part that matters. That's the detail she will turn over in her mind for years, in the quiet of a smaller apartment, in the particular silence of a life that didn't go the way she planned. She will wonder at some point whether things would have been different if she had simply checked the back hallway before she opened her mouth. They wouldn't have been, but she'll wonder. His name was Elijah Carver. He worked the morning shift at a coffee shop called Groundwork, a narrow, honest place on the edge of a neighborhood that hadn't been discovered yet, with exposed brick and a hand chalkboard menu and a pour-over bar he'd built himself from reclaimed oak. He drove a 2009 Honda Accord with a cracked dashboard. He wore the same 4 flannels on rotation. He had a small apartment above a dry cleaner on Clement Street, and he had been there for 6 years, and he had never once mentioned to anyone, not his girlfriend, not her friends, not the regulars who tipped him in exact change, that 3 years prior, in a patent attorney's office on Market Street, he had filed and received full intellectual property protection on a single origin coffee blend he had developed over the course of 9 years. The blend was called Carver No. 7. He had named the first 6 after mistakes. Number 7 was the one that was right. Please let me know in the comments where you are watching today before we continue. I'm always fascinated by how far these tales can go. Don't forget to subscribe to Finest Tales if you like strong, poignant tales of treachery, secrets, and unforgettable retribution, because this story only gets more bizarre from here on out. He heard her before he saw anything. That's the important detail, the one that lodged itself somewhere behind his sternum and stayed there. He had gone back into the building to retrieve his phone, which he'd left charging behind the pour-over station before his shift ended. The event was a wine and cheese thing that Dominic, her new person, the one she had not yet told Elijah was her new person, had organized in the private dining room of the restaurant attached to the building. Elijah had not been invited. He had not known the event was happening. He had come back for his phone. He was in the hallway. She was 12 feet away, behind a door that was mostly closed. And he heard his own name used the way people use a word they finally decided they're done with. He had met Celeste Beaumont 4 years before the hallway. She was a graphic designer with a studio in the Dog Patch, and she had come into Groundwork on a Tuesday morning with a laptop bag and the particular expression of someone who had been told good coffee was here and was prepared to be disappointed. She ordered a pour-over of the house single origin and sat at the bar and watched him work. She came back on Thursday. Then the following Tuesday. Then every weekday for 3 months, until the morning he put her cup down and said, without looking up, "You grind your teeth when you're thinking about a problem." She had looked at him. "How do you know that?" "You've been doing it every time you open that laptop." She had laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and slightly startled, and he had decided then that he liked her very much. They had been good together in the early years. That part is true, and it deserves to be said clearly. She was sharp and creative, and she pushed him on things, asked questions about the roasting process that other people never thought to ask, and he had answered them honestly. And there had been something in those conversations that felt, for a while, like being genuinely known. She visited the shop on slow afternoons and brought her sketch pad and worked at the bar while he cleaned equipment, and the comfortable silence between them was the kind that takes years to build. He had thought about proposing. He had gotten close. He had a specific spot in mind, the eucalyptus grove in the Presidio, where they'd walked the first morning she'd spent the night. And he had thought about it carefully, in the way he thought about everything, methodically, without rushing. The year her studio started doing well was when the frequency of her visits to Groundwork began to drop. It was not sudden. It was the way tides change, incrementally, barely perceptibly, until you notice you're standing somewhere different. Her clients were growing. Her circle was expanding. She began attending events in spaces that had dress codes, and she began returning from those events with a particular restlessness, a faint dissatisfaction that she wore lightly, but that Elijah, who noticed things, noticed. She did not say anything directly. She began instead to make small comments about trajectory, about ambition, about what it meant to build something. He had listened to all of it quietly. He had not told her about the patent. The reason for this was not strategy. It was simpler and more painful than that. Elijah Carver had grown up in a family where money and love had always arrived together and departed together, where the size of his father's business in a given quarter determined whether the dinner table was warm or cold, whether his mother smiled or went quiet for a week. He had spent his 20s constructing a life in which what he made and who he was were not the same thing. The coffee shop was not a cover. It was the thing. It was the work he had chosen with full deliberateness, the craft he had given 9 years of granular, obsessive, unglamorous attention to. He had needed to know, genuinely needed to know, that the person who chose him was choosing the man behind the pour-over bar, not the man whose blend had a patent number and a licensing interest from a Fortune 500 company he was currently in quiet negotiations with. He had needed to know she saw him. She had stopped looking. Dominic Hale had appeared in Celeste's life through the events. That was how these things worked. In this city, in this world, proximity to rooms where the right people gathered was its own form of currency, and Dominic had spent a decade accumulating it. He ran a boutique hospitality consulting firm with a client list that was mostly restaurants and hotels with names that got mentioned in glossy publications. He was tall and well-dressed in the careful, deliberate way of someone who had researched what well-dressed meant and applied it like a formula. He drove a Tesla Model S. He wore watches that caught light. He laughed at the right moments and spoke just below the volume of the room so that people leaned in. Celeste had met him at a brand launch in February. By March, she was attending his events. By April, she was seated next to him at them. Elijah had not been told any of this in sequence. He had received it in fragments, a canceled dinner here, a rescheduled weekend there, the particular quality of her distraction when she was present. He had asked once, directly, whether something had changed. She had said she was busy. He had accepted this, and then he had gone home and sat at his kitchen table, a table he had built from Douglas fir, which she had called charming, and which she had meant as something smaller than that. And he had thought about it for a long time. He had not activated anything. He had simply watched, the way he'd learned to watch everything, with patience and without announcement. The hallway happened 6 weeks later. She was talking to Dominic's business partner, a woman named Freya Langford, who had known Celeste since before the studio took off, and who had now, in the fashion of old friends who have arrived at unequal altitudes, repositioned herself as a confidant rather than an equal. They were talking, Freya and Celeste, in the low conspiratorial register of women who believe a hallway has given them privacy. Elijah stood at the end of it, with his phone in his hand, and did not move. Her voice was light, lightly incredulous, the way people speak about a thing they've decided they understand completely. 7 years making coffee, and he's good at it, he's very good at it, but at some point you have to ask what the ceiling is, right? You have to ask what the plan is. Freya made a sound of agreement. Dominic is building something. He has clients in 4 cities now. He's got the event space and the mission. He's got actual vision. And I've been sitting across from Elijah at that counter for 3 years, waiting for him, I don't know, waiting for something to happen. There was a pause. Does he know about Dominic? Freya asked. Not yet, but he will. She said it with the flatness of someone who has already finished grieving a thing they are still technically inside. I've been embarrassed, honestly. My clients ask what my partner does, and I say he manages a coffee shop, and I watch their face do the thing faces do, and I have to stand there and... She stopped. I've been ashamed for years. I just didn't want to admit it. Elijah stood in the hallway. He did not move. He looked at the phone in his hand for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come, through the side door and out into the evening air. And he stood on the sidewalk in the cooling dark of a San Francisco April, and he breathed. His face was unreadable. His hands were steady. He reached into his back pocket and found a different phone, a second-hand device he used exclusively for communications with his attorney. He had never told Celeste it existed. He opened it now and sent a message to a contact labeled simply RT. The message read, "Move the timeline up. I want everything finalized before the end of the month." Then he put the phone away and walked to his car. The story of Carver number 7 requires some explaining, because the coffee industry is not a world most people understand from the outside, and the nature of what Elijah had built was both highly specific and, in the right context, extraordinarily valuable. He had started developing the blend at 23 in a rented kitchen in Oakland, with a notebook and a digital gram scale and a palette he had spent years deliberately training, the way a musician trains an ear. The single-origin world, the world of traceable, varietally specific, relationship-roasted coffee from specific farms, had been growing for a decade by then. But what Elijah had identified, through a combination of obsessive study and an instinct that was difficult to explain and impossible to teach, was a gap in the premium commercial market. The massive chains, Starbucks, Peet's, the conglomerates, had the logistics and the reach, but were limited in their ability to scale truly distinctive flavor profiles because the intellectual ownership of those profiles, when it existed at all, belonged to the farms that grew the beans, not to the roasters. What Elijah had done through 9 years of work was develop a specific processing method, a combination of fermentation protocol, drying technique, and roast curve that transformed a specific variety of Ethiopian Yirgacheffe into something with a flavor profile so distinct, so reproducible, and so defensible that a patent attorney had looked at his documentation and said, quietly and with professional understatement, that this was unusual and that they should move quickly. The patent was filed in year 7 of development. It was approved in year 8. By year 9, Carver number 7 had come to the attention of a sourcing director at Starbucks' Reserve and Innovation Division through a tasting event Elijah had attended under his LLC name, Seventh Cup Holdings, rather than his own. The sourcing director had tasted the blend blind as part of a flight of 14 submissions and had put her cup down and asked, without looking up, who held the license on the processing method. Elijah had raised his hand. The negotiations that followed were conducted by his attorney, a methodical woman named Ruth Tanaka, who had been representing small-batch IP holders for 20 years, and who, when Elijah had first come to her, had told him that if the blend performed the way he believed it would in scaled testing, the licensing deal alone would be significant. If Starbucks wanted full acquisition rights, the patent, the process, the brand, they would be talking about a different category of number entirely. The scaled testing had concluded 3 months before the hallway. The results had been, in Ruth's word, extraordinary. The offer on the table, as of the evening Elijah stood in the side hallway and heard himself described as an embarrassment, was $380 million, with a $20 million performance earnout, contingent on a successful nationwide rollout of the Carver number 7 reserve line. He had not told anyone, not his co-workers, not his parents, not Celeste. He had wanted to be chosen for the right thing. He had his answer now. Celeste came to the apartment on a Wednesday, 4 days after the hallway. She arrived at 7 in the evening with a canvas tote over her shoulder that Elijah recognized immediately as the kind of bag a person brings when they are removing things rather than bringing them. She sat across from him at the Douglas fir table, and she told him, with the careful, measured composure of someone who had rehearsed the architecture of the conversation, that she had been feeling disconnected for some time, that she had a lot of respect for him, that she felt they had grown in different directions, that she had met someone, and that she thought it was best to be honest. Elijah listened to all of it. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. "I need you to hear something," she said, and this was the part she had not rehearsed as carefully, the part that Freya and 2 glasses of wine had convinced her she owed herself. "I need you to hear that I spent 3 years waiting for you to want more than this, and I can't keep waiting. I'm not saying your life isn't that it's wrong, it's just, you make coffee, Elijah. You are genuinely talented at it. But you make coffee in a coffee shop, and you're going to be making coffee in a coffee shop, and I have been ashamed of that for a long time, and I'm tired of being ashamed of it." She looked at her across the table. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she began to wonder, with a faint flutter of uncertainty, whether she had misjudged how the conversation would land. Then he said, "All right." That was all. She blinked. She had expected more. She had expected anger or argument, or the particular pleading quality of a man who understood he was losing something and was scrambling to prevent it. She had not expected the stillness. She had not expected the way he simply looked at her, level and unhurried, as though she had confirmed something he already knew, and he was now simply noting the confirmation. She stood. She picked up the tote. Inside it, he noticed, were 2 books she had left on his shelf, and a spare phone charger and a scarf, and she walked to the door. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said at the door. She meant it genuinely. That was the thing about Celeste. She was not a cruel person. She was a person who had decided, with conviction, that she understood the situation she was in. She was wrong, but she meant the kindness. He nodded once. She left. He sat at the table for a while after the sound of her footsteps on the stairs faded. He sat with the particular quality of stillness that is not grief, but contains grief somewhere inside it, the stillness of a person who has been told a truth they already knew and is now simply letting it settle into its permanent form. Then he picked up the secondary phone and called Ruth. "We're done waiting," he said. "When?" she asked. "Sign the acquisition agreement. All of it. The full 400. A pause. Ruth did not celebrate audibly. That was one of the things he trusted about her. "I'll file by Monday," she said. "Do it Friday," he said. "I want the announcement ready." He ended the call. He got up and poured himself a cup of water from the tap and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dry cleaner's sign across the alley and the particular orange quality of the sodium lights on Clement Street. And he thought about 9 years of work and what it meant to finally let go of the question of whether any of it was worth it. It was worth it. He had always known it was worth it. The dismantling of Dominic Hale's professional world did not require aggression. It required only the orderly execution of a sequence of events that had been, in one form or another, inevitable since the moment Elijah had filed the patent. Here is how it happened. Dominic's hospitality consulting firm, Hale and Langford, of which Freya Langford was the silent operational partner, had over the previous 2 years built a significant portion of its premium client portfolio around a specific angle: specialty coffee programming. The artisanal beverage experience had become, in the hospitality world, one of the primary differentiators for high-end hotel lobbies, boutique restaurant groups, and corporate event spaces. Dominic had positioned his firm as the connector between premium coffee suppliers and premium venues, and in doing so, had constructed partnerships with 7 regional specialty roasters, 3 of which had, at various points in the previous 18 months, been sourcing beans through a supply channel that was ultimately upstream from Seventh Cup Holdings. He did not know this. There was no reason he would have. The supply chain in specialty coffee was labyrinthine, and Seventh Cup Holdings was not a name that appeared on any of the documentation Dominic had reviewed. What appeared was the name of a regional importer, which purchased processed beans from a cooperative in Ethiopia, which worked exclusively with a small number of licensed processors, one of which held an exclusive agreement with Seventh Cup Holdings for the Carver No. 7 processing method. The licensing agreement meant that any commercial use of the Carver No. 7 process required authorization from the patent holder. When the acquisition finalized, those licensing terms transferred to Starbucks's legal entity, and Starbucks's compliance division, as part of standard post-acquisition IP audit protocol, sent notification letters to all downstream users of the process who were operating without a current commercial license. 3 of the 7 roasters in Dominic's portfolio received those letters on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, 2 of them had suspended their partnerships with Hale and Langford pending legal review. The third had already begun talking to a different consulting firm. This was not Elijah's doing, in the direct sense. He had not called anyone. He had not made a single threatening gesture. He had simply signed an acquisition agreement and allowed the machinery of a $400 million transaction to do what acquisition machinery does. The second element was more personal, though equally legal. Dominic had, 18 months prior, entered into a co-investment arrangement on an event space in the Mission, the one Celeste had mentioned, through a small real estate LLC that had brought in 3 limited partners. One of those limited partners, listed in the operating agreement under Seventh Cup Holdings, had provided bridge financing for the space's renovation. Elijah had made that investment before he had ever met Celeste, before he had ever met Dominic. He had done it because the space had structural bones he liked, and because Ruth had told him the Mission corridor was undervalued for commercial leasing, and that a minority LP position was sensible. He had never attended a meeting. He had never been in the space. When the acquisition closed and Seventh Cup Holdings converted to a subsidiary of a major corporation, the LLC's operating agreement triggered a buyout clause, standard language Ruth had insisted on back when the deal was drafted, requiring the other partners to either purchase the exiting LP stake at fair market value or accept a restructuring of the lease terms. The fair market value, after the Mission corridor's appreciation over 18 months, was not a number Dominic Hale could access quickly. He had most of his liquid capital tied up in a restaurant concept in Hayes Valley that was 6 months behind schedule and $400,000 over budget. He had 2 weeks to arrange the buyout. He did not arrange it. The lease restructuring that followed increased the monthly carrying costs on the event space by a number that made the space's business model effectively non-viable. Dominic Hale did not know, when he began calling investors and brokers and partners in a state of escalating urgency that week, that the entity whose exit had triggered his problems was the same entity whose coffee he had been serving at every event in that space for the past year and a half. He would find out, but not yet. Not yet. The press conference was Dominic's idea. That has to be said plainly, because the decision he made to call the media, to arrange cameras, to stand in front of a microphone and announce a pivot, a new direction, an exciting development in the firm's portfolio, was entirely his own. He had a gift for optics, and when things went sideways, his instinct was always to get ahead of the narrative, before the narrative got ahead of him. He had done it twice before. It had worked both times. He saw no reason this would be different. He scheduled the press conference for a Tuesday at 11 in the morning in the lobby of the Hayes Valley restaurant, the one that was still under construction, which he had decided was actually an asset, a statement about building something, about momentum. He invited 3 journalists from local publications, a business reporter from a Bay Area news outlet, and a photographer. He had prepared a statement about strategic realignment, new hospitality partnerships, a vision for where premium experiential dining was going in the next 5 years. Celeste stood beside him. She was there in the capacity of the firm's new brand partnership. Her studio had taken Hale and Langford on as a client 2 months prior, which was a thing she had mentioned to no one who might have told her it was a conflict. She wore a cream blazer and held a coffee cup from a cafe she had discovered after groundwork became, in her internal accounting, part of a chapter she had closed. The reporters arrived at 11. The photographer set up near the unfinished bar. Dominic stepped to the small podium he had arranged and straightened his jacket and began. He spoke for 6 minutes about the firm's vision. He spoke about the premium hospitality market and where it was going. He spoke about their specialty beverage programming and how it differentiated their client experience. He spoke about the future. The business reporter, a woman named Diane Chen, who had covered the Bay Area food and hospitality industry for 11 years, had been doing her job before the press conference. This is what reporters do. She had, upon receiving the invite, opened her standard background folder on Heal and Langford and begun reading, and she had, in the course of that reading, come across the Starbucks acquisition announcement that had gone out that Friday, the one announcing the full acquisition of Seventh Cup Holdings and the Carver No. 7 patent for a sum in excess of $400 million. She had read the name Elijah Carver. She had read the background section, which described the inventor of the patent as a specialty roaster who had operated quietly under the Seventh Cup Holdings name while working as a barista at a shop in the inner Richmond. She had recognized the neighborhood. She had made one call before driving to Hayes Valley, a former source in the real estate records office who had, in 5 minutes, confirmed what she needed to confirm. She waited until Dominic finished his statement. Then she raised her hand. "Thank you," she said. "A quick question about the Seventh Cup Holdings situation. Our records show that Seventh Cup Holdings was a limited partner in the LLC that holds the lease on this space. We also understand the departure of that LP triggered a restructuring that significantly changed the carrying costs. Can you speak to how the firm is managing that and whether the pivot you're announcing today is related?" He was a man who had survived uncomfortable moments by controlling his face, and he controlled it now for approximately 4 seconds before the specific quality of the silence in the room made something shift. "We're managing the transition actively," he said. It's a restructuring that's actually creating some new opportunities for us in terms of how we think about our... And for context, Diane said, looking at her notes with the calm of someone who has already written the story and is simply gathering the quotes, Seventh Cup Holdings is the LLC that held the patent on the Carver No. 7 blend, the one that was acquired by Starbucks last week for $400 million. Is that the same entity? A photographer clicked. The shutter sound was very loud in the unfinished space.